A new 3-year wage agreement with a 7% pay increase per year has been reached by trade unions at South African power provider Eskom on Thursday. Since April, representatives of Solidarity, the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa, called NUMSA, and the National Union of Mineworkers, NUM, have been in negotiations with Eskom to come to an agreement before the end of this month, when the existing wage agreement expires. It comes as the utility is implementing electricity cuts, leaving South African households and businesses in the dark for up to about 10 hours a day as it struggles with breakdowns at its coal-fired generating units. The deal also includes a 7% rise in non-managerial workers' housing allowances over the 3-year period and a taxable payment of 10,000 rand, that's about $545.03 in each of the first 2 years of the agreement. Now, the unions had initially sought wage hikes of about 9.5% to about 12%, and NUM and NUMSA had first demanded 15% rise in payments, while Solidarity sought 10.1%. But now 7% has been agreed and signed. So from Johannesburg, South Africa, Phakamile Hlubi-Majola, NUMSA national spokesperson, joins me to discuss this. Thank you so much, Phakamile, for joining us.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to your viewers. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome. Now, Eskom's acting CEO, that is Khalib Kasim, described this particular agreement being signed by NUM and NUMSA as one of the major challenges, pressing challenges, like a hurdle that had to be crossed. But then I'd like to ask, why does it seem as though the agitation for wage increase is more important than issues surrounding Eskom, which has to do with bringing it up to capacity, dealing with the issues of its debt, and of course, finding solutions around Africa's power crisis?
So I think, first of all, it's a mistake to characterize the wage talks as if somehow the power utility is not taking the other issues of load shedding seriously. And somehow the demands of what workers have made are in some way problematic against the backdrop of power cuts. The reality is that every year or every time a wage agreement expires, we have to come around, have talks, and renegotiate a new wage agreement, which is going to govern labor relations at Eskom for trade unions within Eskom. So whether there's load shedding or not, that is the reality of how labor relations in South Africa works. So the wage agreement at Eskom is actually expiring at the end of June. And we had to then come together and come up with a new collective agreement, which is going to guide our labor relations with the Eskom management. We came to an agreement which we view as a very positive step, actually, not just in terms of labor relations at Eskom, but also in terms of providing labor stability at the entity, which, by the way, would play a crucial role in terms of dealing with the problems of the incessant power cuts that we have in this country. Because at the end of the day, Eskom is only going to solve the problem of persistent load shedding by working together with workers at Eskom. Now, it is an objective fact that workers at Eskom have been denied a meaningful wage increase since 2016-2017 financial year. If you look at Eskom's financial statements and you look at what are Eskom's cost drivers, the cost of wages and benefits for workers in the Central Bargaining Forum have remained flat since 2016-2017 to show you that workers at Eskom have actually been denied meaningful wage increases. Now, these talks, the purpose of these talks was to try and find a balance in order to try and resolve that historical issue and be fair to the same workers who are working tirelessly to keep the lights on, to keep the grid from collapsing, and to try and find long-term solutions to load shedding. And we do think that the agreement that we've just recently signed is a very progressive agreement. It's one that actually addresses some of the core wage demands of workers, but at the same time, it's not going to have a negative impact on Eskom's balance sheet because, as I said to you, it's never been workers' wages that were problematic in terms of Eskom's finances. What has actually always negatively impacted on Eskom's finances has been the bloated and exorbitant procurement expenditure for costs around diesel, for costs around renewable energy independent power producers, as well as the costs for coal.
All right, and now that you said that wage agreements and discussions are something that would have to happen, of course, it's between a time lapse, and definitely when you get to the expiration of that particular agreement, there's need for negotiation. But now we're seeing that industrial actions by unions in South Africa is becoming a yearly ritual. Your members embarked on one last year. So is it just about discussions around wage increase, or there are some other issues that Eskom is not looking into and dealing with that usually springs up this kind of agitations and industrial actions by the members?
So what we had last year was a very, very toxic negotiating environment created by the former GCO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter. Andre had actually been appointed by the Department of Public Enterprises to deal with labor. And it was clear from the time that he was appointed that his mandate was to basically, retrench workers en masse, roll back on the rights and benefits that workers at Eskom had achieved, and fast-track the privatization of the state-owned power utility. What was also unfortunate about the decision-making of the government by appointing Andre was that they basically appointed a clueless individual who knew nothing about engineering, had no technical experience in engineering. Andre had no technical experience in engineering. He'd never run an organization like Eskom before, which is very, very technical in terms of how it operates. He's a lawyer by profession and not an engineer. Never, ever had any experience with any kind of state-owned utility. And this was one of the biggest mistakes that this government made. It's a mistake that we are paying for now because with the crippling load shedding that we're experiencing, because one of the key performance indicators of any GCO at Eskom is that they have to roll out a proper maintenance program for the power stations so that those power stations are able to run properly and to ensure that the lights stay on consistently. But because Andre didn't have a clue of the entity that he was working with, had no idea what quality maintenance of a power station looked like, we now find ourselves at the worst stages of load shedding that Eskom has ever experienced in the history of its existence. And this is what Andre did to Eskom. So unfortunately for the state, their plans backfired spectacularly. Andre failed to implement the plan of fast-tracking the privatization and of undermining collective bargaining. His decision to resign was in itself a gift. We view it as a gift as the unions, because I can tell you part of the reason why we were able to wrap up these wage talks as quickly as we were able to this year, and the fact that we were able to even secure some of the gains we secured, was purely because Andre was not in the room and was not sabotaging wage talks. He did that last year, and his utterances, his attitude actually sparked anger amongst workers during the height of winter, during the height of load shedding, and caused them to embark on pickets and protests at various power stations around the country.
But Phakamile, sorry to cut you there. Phakamile, sorry to cut you. Now, Andre Reuter has come out to say that because you're putting the blame on him for the poor lift-off and, of course, the poor operations of Eskom and the management of the entity. But then Andre Reuter has come out to allege that there have been cases of sabotage and corruption on the part of the workers, fellow executives, and maybe politicians, and that has impeded his ability to bring his plan to fruition for Eskom. So don't you see that also in that light, that there could have been some people, some with vested interests, who may have undermined the plans or the ideas that it was hoping to implement for Eskom?
I'm so glad you raised the issue of sabotage. It's something that has been used routinely over and over and over again by both Andre and the Minister of Public Enterprises to scapegoat workers at Eskom for the problems of Eskom. We need to be clear about one thing. There's been no evidence to prove the sabotage that they are claiming. Andre de Ruyter's revelations, where he claimed that there was massive looting to the tune of 1 billion rand, he said this in an interview on ENCA, have actually been discredited and disproven by other media reports locally in South Africa. He relied on an investigation led by an apartheid-era spy, and his allegations, which he made in Parliament, have been made without a shred of evidence. And what is even more disturbing is that Andre, as the group CEO of Eskom, is actually, in terms of our laws, the most senior accounting officer. He has signed off for the last 3 years on Eskom's finances. And yet he cannot even show you in those finances that he signed off on where the 1 billion rands worth of looting that he claims is taking place a month, where is it in the finances of Eskom? What Andre did when he made those allegations was to try and cleanse himself of his spectacular failure as a GCO in terms of actually resolving the crisis of load shedding. The revelations that he made in interviews, the book that he wrote during the time when he was supposed to be fixing power stations, was done as a way to distract the public from the fact that he has been the worst CEO to ever run Eskom in the history of its existence.
Okay.
Eskom CEOs are judged according to their ability to increase the energy availability factor. Andre failed spectacularly.
Okay, Magapili, let's look at other areas now. Now, we see that the unions asked for 9.5% at some point, or between 9.5 and 12%. Solidarity asked for a 10.1% wage increase, but now the agreement has been settled at 7%. Now, are all the unions in consonance with these particular agreements? Because we're talking about wage disparity, salary disparity, and the need to harmonize the payment and see that everybody is at an equilibrium. So is everybody carried along with this? And are you optimistic or sure that Eskom will be able to sustain the payments because of its debt and other financial obligations, and may not, before the expiration of these particular trade agreements, come around to say, let's renegotiate? I cannot sustain the payment of these wages.
So yes, what we think is that, first of all, we did obviously come into these talks with demands. NUMSA, for example, at the beginning of these talks had a demand of a double-digit increase. If you look at where we settled at 7%. And the agreement that we signed is that we guaranteed a 7% increase for each year for the 3 years of the duration of the wage agreement. Now, for us, 7% is an acceptable compromise. You have to remember that wage talks are about compromise. So even if you come in with your demands, you have to be willing to compromise. And for us, where we've compromised, we think that this has been an acceptable compromise because at least this increase is inflation-based. Inflation in South Africa at the moment is at 6.8%. So the fact that we have secured a 7% increase for us is a good thing. And the fact that we signed, as I said, a 3-year agreement means that Eskom now has labor stability, which means that for the next 3 years, the only thing that Eskom should be worried about, and all workers of Eskom should be worried about, is improving the performance of the power utility so that we no longer have to be subjected to persistent load shedding. Now, in relation to some of the other demands, for example, the demands around the wage differentiation, there were also demands around benefits with regards to the car allowance, for example. There are certain issues which have been relegated, which will be dealt with over the next 12 months in the relevant forums, negotiating forums within Eskom, where we will deal with those aspects separately. But overall, the fact that we secured a 3-year agreement at 7% for each year, and the payment of a bonus for workers, 10,000 rand to be paid in the first year, 10,000 rand again to be paid in the second year. For us, these are all good things, and a 7% increase per year for housing allowance are all positive developments. And this is why overwhelmingly workers within all unions welcomed this agreement and were willing to sign it.
All right, now there is seen that on the part of the workers, there seems to be a bit of settlement and an agreement. We also want to look at the part of Eskom and see how to settle its future in terms of making, scaling up its operations, making it more viable and making it more stronger in terms of power generation and distribution. Now the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has proposed that it would, or has actually proposed that it wants to split Eskom into 3 firms to scale up its operations and increase its efficiency in terms of service delivery. Are you in support of this? Do you think that this will happen anytime soon? And what impact do you think this will have on the operation of the utility?
No, we're totally opposed to the breaking up of Eskom. It's just a way of privatizing the entity, which we wholeheartedly reject. If you look at what other countries are doing overseas, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I read recently that France recently nationalized one of the energy companies because they recognize that energy is a strategic asset. It is foolish for any government to privatize an energy entity. China hasn't done it. Any country that wants to take itself seriously in terms of industrialization, in terms of building the economy, in terms of ensuring rapid industrial growth, does not hand over their most strategic energy assets to the private sector. So we think that this is a fatal mistake that the South African government is making. They are pandering to the demands of the World Bank. This will leave the masses in this country worse off because the purpose of a state-owned utility, certainly a state-owned power utility like Eskom, is that it has the power to ensure that and manage the cost of energy. Energy, in terms of what Eskom's original mandate was when it was originally established, it was never an entity that was supposed to generate profit.
Okay.
It was an entity that was supposed to electrify the whole country. And we believe that that mandate has yet to be fulfilled if you consider that we are one of the poorest countries with highest levels of inequality, unemployment in the world.
Okay.
So if we want to tackle that issue directly, you should not break Eskom up and hand it over to the private sector.
All right, thank you so much, Phakamile, for joining us. We are looking at how we can bring about efficiency to Eskom and, of course, make South African workers smile like you're doing. So we hope that that can cut across all discussions. Thank you so much for joining us.